Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
My God, it's full of stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm one of your regular hosts, Scott Weatherly, and as usual, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm ready to wrap up the first episode, the first season. It's like we're having a wrap party, Scott.
It is, yes. This is it. We're going to go back and have a look at all the films we've looked at for season one. And actually, something that we sort of agreed, I think, Julian, it was your idea, really, is the one thing we didn't really do was give them a rating, was it?
No, and
So-
I like the idea. I think actually I credit you with the idea. But I love the idea, and I kind of like the idea of leaving it to the wrap episode, and then sort of hashing out all those ratings.
So this is it. That's what we're going to do. We're going to go back, have a think about anything that sort of stuck out for us in those 10 films, and then we're going to give each of them a rating and sort of talk through where they all sit in our 1 to 10 for this series. So before we start, though, I think, is it worth giving a quick rundown of the films that we had in the season?
Yeah, absolutely. We
Okay.
started with Forbidden Planet, 1956.
Then you took me on a Russian journey with Solaris from 1952.
1971.
1971. That I want to ask you about that actually, because yes, you say 1971. I think I've got like an American release date, but yes. So we had
Okay.
Solaris, then
Then we went to Star Wars, 1977.
yes,
Had quite a
that was-
contentious, fun conversation about that.
we did. Then we talked about employees' rights in Blade Runner from 1982.
And then we went into body horror and, David Cronenberg's Strangeness with The Fly in 1987.
Then we jumped in from all these live action films to our first animated movie. So we went to Japanimation, manga, and we went to Akira from 1988.
Then there's a big gap. And the next
Yeah.
film is actually 9 years later. And that's Starship Troopers, Paul Verhoeven's bizarre satire on a sort of fascist future that seems all too familiar to me now. And a favorite of both of ours.
Indeed, yeah, that was a great conversation. And then again, like another quite nice gap, really, because we jumped forward to 2004 and the time travel indie film Primer, which was a complex conversation, if ever there was one.
Yeah, that was fascinating. That was one of those where I forced you to watch it, and in the end, you less thrilled with it than I am. But that was interesting.
Yeah, definitely, yeah, it's definitely an interesting film, and it's regardless of what my rating is, it's still a recommend for people to try out.
Well, then we went to 2010 with Chris Nolan's Inception, sort of classic for me.
And then we rounded it out again with a slightly sort of a contentious conversation around 2012 Looper and a very different take on time travel from what Primer presented. But that was it. That's our 10. So they're the films that we're going to go back and sort of talk about. But before we sort of get into the ratings and everything, the first thing is really sort of looking at those 10. Is there anything in that really that stands out, or any thoughts that sort of came through sort of reviewing these 10 films?
Yeah, I've thought about this, and it's sort of what stood out for me. Obviously, our discussions of Solaris and Star Wars and Looper and Primer, the ones where we disagreed are sort of the more interesting ones in some way for me, because I get to experience another perspective, and I respect you, and I always get what you're saying, even though it's not my approach, but it's like I can see your in my subjectivity, I can see your subjectivity. I can imagine another mind space engaging with this same sort of geometric construct that I know, and looking at it from a different side and seeing different facets in a different way. And I can totally project myself into that mind space, and that is amazing to me, and it lets me see that construct from a different way.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, because I think one of the things is one of the, like, as you sort of said before, I think this would be a really boring sort of podcast if we both came to it and we just sort of like, yeah, we both love it, and on to the next episode. And so the fact that we do come at these from different angles and sort of different levels of enjoyment, I think, has really made these conversations so fascinating for me that I've just really enjoyed sort of picking these up. In particular, I would say, I call out Solaris, and I think I've sort of poked and prodded a gentle sort of fun at this film.
You're
but it's one of
prodding
those
a Russian bear.
Yeah, indeed. But it's one of those that sort of, I think, if I watched it off Amazon Prime, and I know it'd come because I knew about the remake, the George Clooney remake. So it's one of those that I think I've come across before and gone, I'm not sure I can give that the time at the moment, and moved on. And it's still, and then when you sort of said, oh yeah, we're going to do it, I was like, okay, this does sound like a challenge. It sounds interesting. So, and it was the same with Primer, that, I knew of its existence. It had been on my watch list. And so for you to say, oh no, this is something, we should watch, and it's sort of really worth the conversation. And it is, but it's a challenging film to watch. And I think that's sort of, for me, like we could have just sort of rested on our laurels a little bit and done all the sort of the easy targets maybe. But the one thing I enjoyed about this was that we have actually thrown in some interesting concepts and some interesting perspectives for these films.
Yeah, and I know what you're talking about sort of carving out the space to watch something. I so often, you're tired at the end of the day, and you go to your DVR, and the first stuff I watch is always the stupid TV show that I don't really care about. Ironically, if it's a show that I really like, I think, well, I'm too tired. I want to give that my full attention. I hope that it's going to be a good episode and it's going to take me on a journey. So even if it's a TV show that I'm expecting that from, I often put it off. But a movie, let alone a sort of 2.5 hour, 3 hour movie, really requires a kind of commitment. And I can understand why, a lot of times it's easier to go for something that, is funner, or that doesn't require that kind of attention. And I often find myself doing that. But then sometimes I look back and I think, why have I had that supposed masterpiece? Like it's way in the bottom of my DVR. I know that would be like, it's like, that's good nutrition, right? That's the salad. And I'm just eating these crappy sandwiches every day, and I'm disgusting. I hate what I'm doing. I should watch that. And I think, no, I'll have some chips.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, because there are a series of films that Oscar-winning films, sort of like hard-hitting, sort of like thrillers and dramas and science fiction films. I go, I really need to watch those, and you go, ooh, there's a new episode of The Housewives of Beverly Hills, and you're like, I'll watch that instead. Not that I actually watched that. I was trying to think of something else, but yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Something easy to digest. So I like that not only has this challenged me to watch those films, but it's actually challenged me to think about them in a different way. And I think sort of, especially, I mean, I'll admit it, I think our Star Wars conversation has changed the way I approach Star Wars. And not just the first film, the entire trilogy, really. In the sense of, like, I still watch it and enjoy it. I can still watch it and I can still switch my brain off and enjoy it as a sort of a pulpy fantasy sort of, sci-fi adventure. But I understand that really it's not actually that good. and it has like glaring, gaping plot holes and everything else. And and that's actually it's worth acknowledging those things as well. And if you can't acknowledge that and admit that you still love it and sort of go, yeah, it's not great, but here's why I enjoy it, then I think you're sort of missing out on some of those conversations that are worth having.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I admire you that you've gone through that process. I mean, I have had to go through that process so many times where I realized, like, yeah, you love this and you really want to hold on tight to this, Julian, but kind of not that great. Or I slowly realize, like, yeah, I still absolutely am in love with this movie or in love with this comic, but yeah, I don't know that I could just kind of recommend it wholeheartedly to somebody, or
No,
it's important to bracket stuff and see it for what it is.
yeah, totally. And so it's been good to have these conversations. And I think there's weird sort of like themes as well that seem to have jumped out for me that doing this 10, and this 10 is a combination of you and I. Like
Hmm.
we both sort of contributed to this, and so watching this, I was quite interested to sort of see the films that we chose and that sort of thing. But there are certain things that sort of come out again and again, and sort of I feel that sort of weirdly, of all the sort of things we've had, it's like Starship Troopers is the one that sort of seems to stand out to me a lot. Um, Mainly because I think hadn't been back to it for a short time, and um, I'd been back to RoboCop relatively recently, and to see how good this satire was and how fun that film is, it really does sort of surprise me how much that stands up. But also, I started to realize like how much the military seems to pop up in sci-fi films.
Hmm.
They sort of whether it's sort of at the forefront or in the background. So the forefront is obviously like Starship Troopers and to an extent like Forbidden Planet. But within all of this, like Solaris has got an element of military sort of bureaucracy in it. Blade Runner, sort of like Roy Batty, explains that he's sort of like a soldier replicant. Akira has got combat with the military in. It seems to come up again and again. So it seems that sort of like even at random, like sci-fi sort of has this need for sort of almost like a military element to it. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, all I can think is that when you're imagining a sort of like future scenario, if there is conflict or there is a threat, I think it's sort of logical to say, well, what are the authorities doing about this? And the bigger the
Mm.
threat, the more you have to assume that there's some sort of military or coordinated presence. And also it's just, I mean, Star Wars has a military element, right? I mean,
Mm.
they're fighting a guerrilla war against an empire and its massive military might. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that definitely is a theme. I've always thought of it as sort of a side effect of the subject matter or the story in particular, but it certainly makes for great spectacle to have
Mm.
space marines fighting bugs.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's just interesting to sort of see how they're portrayed, especially if you sort of take. I mean, they are sort of 40 years apart, pretty much. But you have got Forbidden Planet and Starship Troopers, and they're two sort of military forces going off to outer space, and I enjoy how differently they are portrayed. I mean, it's sort of Forbidden Planet is more like a navy, sort of like they've all sort of got their bunks on the ship, and it's a very sort of naval sort of setup. Through to Starship Troopers, which obviously covers the entire gamut of the military sort of arms. But I like the fact that it's a lot more gentle and almost Starfleet like in Forbidden Planet.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that it comes from that sort of 50s place of sort of assuming, like, yeah, there are some idiots in the military, right? I mean,
Mm.
all of those films from the 50s, there's always the bumbling private, in the military, but at the same time, there's not. It's as if there's no real question that the overall apparatus or the overall organization is good. It's
Mm.
not inherently corrupt. It's not inherently, you know, colonization to go out to these planets. That's just not going to be questioned, right? It's a good organization. It might have some bad eggs, but there's never any question that it's a positive force, or at the worst has no positive or negative charge, that it's just neutral and it is what it is.
Mm.
But Starship Troopers comes from a place that I think is a lot more informed. Obviously it's informed by Vietnam, but when you're talking about the 90s, it holds up, and one of the reasons why it holds up is because it does seem a much more realistic portrayal of not just the military, but also what we would do. I mean, humans are
Mm. Yeah.
not the most
Yeah.
benevolent Starfleet-like civilization. Like, that's fine, alien civilizations, but not touch them. No, for that might
Yeah.
be the one government's official policy, but the corporations are going to be out there paying people to slaughter bugs to get some juice out of them or something.
Actually, that's a good point. I think that's the one thing that sort of probably is missing from uh, Starship Troopers, which may not have been a part of sort of thing in the 90s, but would definitely be something now, would be how could they sort of commercialize it? How could they turn it into some sort of money making scheme? Because I'm pretty sure there would be, and there would be that thing, wouldn't there? Of sort of like, oh yeah, we found that like we actually, if you take bugs, endoskeletons, or they can sort of, we can turn them into these, and we're going to use it as sort of like it's a fashion design or something. Yeah,
Yeah, the
there's
sort
always
of
someone that.
yeah, I mean, it's a Starship Troopers was, one of the things that shocked me, about that conversation was you're telling me about how a lot of people just read it straight.
Yeah.
That was what stood out for me most about that conversation, and of course that's horrifying. But I think that sometimes, like, I am very sort of in my bubble, and I don't know that it's a sort of ivory tower bubble or it's a artsy fartsy bubble, but I mean, I am definitely in a kind of bubble, and some of that is to survive, because every time that I see, um, Ghost Adventures, a horrible reality show where they go to houses and say, there's a ghost here, and scare each other. That's had like 12 seasons, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's had 12 seasons, and we can't get like, you know, three of some brilliant show that got canceled too soon that nobody watched. And I think
Mm.
I want to kill myself just thinking
Yeah.
about that. I don't want to live in that world. So I think I shield myself from not exactly reality, but kind of mainstream views sometimes to keep
Mm-mm.
myself alive. so
Yeah.
so several of these films, but I've learned about that, and certainly Starship Troopers was one of them.
No, yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? Sort of like you say, you can read these films different ways. That's fine, but there's definitely a concern. I think that some people do read these, um, like you say, just straight, without looking at sort of the questions, everything that does go behind them. I think as we sort of said, I think that was one of the reasons I liked our conversation on Inception so much, because about this thing about the human tragedy at the heart of that film. That people don't seem to. When you look at the reviews of that film and sort of people discussing it, it's all about sort of like the cinematography and the concept and the spectacle and some of the acting,
Mm-hmm.
but there's never any real mention of like this. It's a really sort of, it's a human tragedy, that film. Like it's a real sort of,
Yeah.
like you said, when you really get into it, it's quite a sort of like a proper tragedy, and that barely gets mentioned, and I just find that like bizarre.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and I think that's very true for me about Inception. Both the the love story at the heart of it, which I always hate the love plot, right? I mean, the love plot is like the B plot that they put in, and I think, yeah, you didn't need this. And Inception, feels like it should be that B plot, right? I mean, it's a
Mm.
mechanic that drives the plot, but damn if it works, and damn if it doesn't feel like the heart of the film. And even the stuff with the person they're incepting dealing with his father, I mean,
Mm.
there's stuff where that's just plot, but there's stuff that really resonates with me, and I think that conversation, I mean, like, it's interesting to me that I go there with Inception, and I have no problem going there with Inception, but one of the most interesting conversations to me was about Looper, and
Mm.
that I could never once went there with Looper. Like, I can't understand those as characters in no sense, and you approached it so much from a character perspective that it really opened my eyes and made me think, well, why do I not do that? Why does my heart not open to those characters? And it does to Inception, which most people don't even think of those as characters.
I'll be fair. It might be down to the actual quality of the film. That might be something to do with it. Because you're right. Because I will acknowledge when it comes to our ratings, we'll see. But um, Inception as a piece of art, as a piece of cinema, I think isn't perfect. It has some excellent moments in it, and I'll acknowledge. I think as an overall piece, it's a better film than Looper. And like you said, the mechanics and that we sort of, as we said, the mechanics and the sort of sci-fi elements of Looper are a little daft, to be honest, and then some. But yeah, for some reason, there's just something about that film that I work beyond, and I just sort of I get quite a lot of investment from that film. It's some I can explain, some I probably couldn't. Um, but yeah, it is interesting that sort of like sometimes they just that thing can just hook you, and you're into it, sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think that, going back to like the point about Star Wars, that I always feel, that I like Transformers toys.
Hmm.
It's a sort of hobby of mine, and I look at reviews of these toys and watch these reviews on YouTube and whatnot. Um, there's a lot of contentious fighting about all of this, right? Everybody's like, "How can you possibly prefer this to that? You're an idiot." People fight, and of course, it's ridiculous, right? You're fighting about toys, right? This is dumb, but the best reviewers always say, like, look, this is my opinion. Some of this is objective, right? Like, this is just poorly made right here. Some of it
Yeah.
is just aesthetics, it's subjective. But I mean, I'm right about those things that are objective. Those are really there. There might be things I'm missing, and I'll admit when I'm missing them. But at the end of the day, even if you disagree with that or you just don't care, those aren't objective problems that matter to you. If you like it, you win. So, I mean, if
Mm.
you like the movie or you like that toy, you get a toy that you like. That's awesome. If you like the movie
Yeah.
and it works for you, how awesome is it? You get a sci-fi movie that excites you and moves you. That's so amazing to me. And we don't have to agree on everything. And to me, it's such a trump card to just say, like, it works for me. I like it. I feel joy for watching Looper. I care about those characters. It takes me someplace emotionally. It's like, what? Yeah. Who can argue with that? I mean, I can point
Mm.
out an objective flaw with that little hinge on that toy over there. But if a child's face lights up to see that toy, does it, we can step back and say, yeah, that stitching's not so great. But look at that kid's face.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I think that's one of the things that sort of I'm going to say, especially when we get into sort of season two, because we've got a couple of films in season two that I think you and I are sort of acknowledge probably aren't fantastic films, or well, there's, but I think we both have put films in there that we absolutely love for different reasons. And I think that's going to be a big part of the conversation. It's going to be this thing of like, no, this is why I love it, because I think this bit's amazing. I think acknowledging that is so important, and it's sort of, I think it's one of the things that's missing from fandom in general. I'm trying to think. I saw something recently talking about Well, even let's just admit it, like the latest Star Wars film, sort of the Rise of Skywalker, like to me, it didn't work. Like it was fine, it was meh, but I didn't get that sort of like, there's people that are sort of, it hit me, with that wave of nostalgia, and it did this and it did that, and I was like, well, didn't work for me. I'm not bothered by it. But do you know what? I'm so glad that there are people that are satisfied by it. But then, it's that thing of, but then I understand there's frustration because it's obviously got such a lot hanging on it of people that are disappointed. But then I'm sort of like, I don't get why people get so angry at the people that do enjoy it. It's sort of like, oh, do you know what I mean? It's like a jealousy thing, almost like, well, how dare you get joy out of this, and I can't. And I'm more like, no, fair play, well done that you've got that. It didn't work for me, but I'm so glad that you enjoy it. You know what I mean? It's sort of, it's an odd one. I think people are just bizarre in that way, that they sort of this resentment at other people enjoying something, that's, at the end of the day, it's a film, and it's sort of, if it means something to them, wonderful.
Absolutely. But it's interesting that you phrase it that way about, the problem being people who don't like it, hating people who like it, because most of what I see is, from my subjective experience, is the reverse, is people who like it, just attacking anyone who has any kind of criticism. So what I find is, especially with Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars is not the most toxic fandom of any franchise, but it certainly has its toxic elements. And, I mean, I don't think, I never reviewed, for Sequart, the sequel films. I never did. I think I did Rogue One because I loved it and I wanted to talk about, what I really loved. But both The Force Awakens, which I liked much better than The Last Jedi, but both of them are movies that I can demolish with a single sentence. I mean, they have advantages, but if you can demolish a movie with a single sentence, it's not good. It's got problems. But I didn't dare. Honestly, I did not write those reviews because I knew I would face such intense backlash, and the anger and hostility directed at anybody who just tweeted like I didn't like this was so violent. So I sort of see it from the other perspective, and I know both sides are true and that this happens. I just don't understand why anyone gets that mad about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's bizarre. It's an interesting. I mean, it's people that they are so invested in these things, and again, it's good that they are. And it's funny that when people say, oh, Ryan Johnson or J.J. Abrams, they've ruined my childhood. And you're like, well, no, they really didn't, because it's not like they've come around and like smashed up your toys or taken away the original trilogy or just come around and slapped your mum. It's like they haven't done anything. It's a film at the end of the day.
Right.
But one of the just to rib on Star Wars, like a final. We'll round out the Star Wars thing in a moment. But there was recently a tweet, and this goes back to I did a bit of a whole Star Wars retrospective with a couple of other podcasts for 20th Century Geek, and we sort of went through all the films. And then there was a tweet recently of for the last sort of film, these Star Destroyers were created by these people that were like cultists of the Sith. Did you know that? Or you never knew this? One of these sort of clickbaity articles.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, you're right, I never knew that, because it's never mentioned in the film. So how am I supposed to know that? And there's a thing about it could be mentioned in this comic. And I was like, that is the biggest problem with a lot of these. Well, not a lot of these franchises, particularly Star Wars. There was one of the contributors to the retrospective, a guy called Mike, from a podcast called Genuine Chit Chat, and he's a big Star Wars fan. Like, he's read all the not all, but he's read a lot of the comics, a lot of the Legend stuff. And every time we came to a plot hole, like a massive gaping plot hole, he'd be like, oh, well, actually, in this book, in this thing here, they actually address that, and they give you this backstory. And I'm like, I don't care. I shouldn't have to go and read something else, or go play this game, or go watch this other thing. Like, that should not be how this medium works. That I've got to go fill in these gaps. And so one of the things that sort of, infuriated me, and actually sort of, having done the reviews, put me off the Star Wars franchise more and more, was like, yeah, it just feels like almost like a enforced engagement with the franchise. Because you're like, well, we have shown you the films, but if you really want to know the story, come and check out the Marvel comics. If you really want to know the history, come and play the games. I was just like, no, I'm fine. Thank you very much. And I think that's a bit of a shame, really.
I think it's also just bad criticism, frankly, because when you go to judge, I mean, obviously this gets into like literary theory and new criticism versus other stuff, but when you judge a movie, you want to judge that movie, right? Now we can have a discussion about whether it matters what we know about those actors or those directors. I have had so many discussions about that. Like, can you still enjoy a Woody Allen movie? Can you watch Kevin Spacey without thinking about what he's done, or Bill Cosby, or whatever, or Michael Jackson? So there are things outside of the movie that get brought into the work of art. That's also true of, obviously if it's a sequel, it kind of presumes that you've seen the previous one. It is true that sequels then kind of retrospectively color the earlier episodes, but to point to something that is outside of that work, like, well, there's a book over here, there's a comic over here of questionable canonical status anyway, that explains this plot hole. Well, that doesn't mean it's not a plot hole, right? It just means somebody over here offered an explanation. Well, good on you, right? But that does not affect the movie at all. It doesn't mean that's not a problem with the movie. And then there's another version of the same thing. My friend Mike Phillips, who I write with, and he's one of my best friends. He loves Richard Kelly, the director, and so he loves Donnie Darko, Southland Tales, The Box. I don't like any of these movies. I mean, and some of them are just objectively bad, or objectively have problems with it. But he loves to, when he's finished with a movie, go read what people say about it or what the explanation is. And so he kind of will say, hey, I don't understand that. I mean, he loves David Lynch stuff, right? So he'll say, I don't understand that. Well, let's see what that was about. And then he finds a critic who says, or the director who says, well, what I was intending was to mirror this and to mirror that and comment on this. And, and if you think about it, here's what it's all analogous to. Yeah, well, that's not in the movie, man.
Yes.
Like, that's cool, but that doesn't make it a better movie.
No, and I agree. That's the thing. It's sort of, I think sometimes the message they're trying to give, or sort of something they're trying to convey, if they might think they're doing that, but yeah, it doesn't land. And yeah, I think sometimes I say some people claim things are art when they're not art, and that sort of thing as well. I mean, they can say anything's art, I suppose, but there's this thing of, retrospectively, sometimes I think, certain directors and stuff try to give things a meaning and a message and go, no, that's what I meant. I meant it to be this. And it's a statement on the, the human, what it is to be human, and sort of stuff. No, it's not really. It's it's a fun film, but it's not that, So yeah, I do find that with sort of, in fact, I'd say because criticism is now so instant, because of social media and sort of the internet and stuff. I do find that sort of you get this more and more. As you said, that Mike goes out to find these sort of these answers, or these sort of these statements or theories. That these things appear quicker than ever. The film is released, and all of a sudden you've got all these sort of things online, whether it be a clickbait article or the writer or director saying, well, this is our intention, this is what we meant. And you're sort of like, well, yeah, but that's fine. But also, I also think that the moment you put a piece of art out there, especially a film, it no longer really means what you want it to mean. It can be,
Right.
whatever the person that's viewing it takes it from, and that can change depending on the mood you're in when you watch it. If you've had a really bad day compared to having a fantastic day, you may read a movie completely differently. So I do think it's good to sort of, if they really do mean that, but I also do think some of it is complete waffle, um, which is interesting in itself.
Right. And I think that, I mean, you can prove, getting back to literary theory, I mean, you can prove that the author's intent is irrelevant.
Mm,
So, I mean, if it is perfectly possible for the author to have at one intent and for the end result to actually display unconscious biases or have something that is objectively there that wasn't intended. Maybe a collaborator put it in, or it just is there in the plot, and they were not focused on that. Um, I mean, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, right, was supposed to be about you need to stop eating this wretched meat. Um,
right.
it was actually about the workers rather. So
Mm,
it was about workers' rights, and these workers are treated terribly. But all of America read it and said, "Wait a minute, this meat is like being urinated on and thrown on the floor."
yeah.
Let's get some meat laws. Let's get some food laws, which we didn't have any at the time. And some Republicans want to go back to that, but um, it had a totally different effect than what was intended. That doesn't mean that it doesn't horrify you for its depiction of this food processing, right?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
so somebody's intent or somebody's thoughts about it. You can write an article about how I mean, I'm thinking about The Fly and how The Fly objectively does deal with issues of the body and getting older, masculinity. I mean, there are those things that are there. I mean, somebody could write an article about how it reflects Nietzsche's Ubermensch. That doesn't make it a better film, man.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, it's interesting. I do think, I think what we're eventually going to get around to is, as we give these our ratings out of 10, is that, there's an element of subjectiveness going to be in these, and I think that's the truth with all films. But that's why I love these conversations. Is that a lot of these I've come to and sort of watched it and gone, yeah, that's sort of how I've read it, and I think the changing I've had around Star Wars has been a really interesting one. Um, but then going back and watching some of these films, so these discussions, has actually made me appreciate them more. So if I just went back and watched it as a film, um, I'd probably give it a lower score than I would now, than having gone back and watched it and sort of just discussed it. So, but that doesn't mean it, like you said, that doesn't mean it's any better of a film. The film itself hasn't changed.
Right.
Just my sort of maybe understanding or appreciation or interpretation of it has changed. So it's the film is the film. Like, there's no, they haven't changed a second of that, apart from Blade Runner, which changed 7 times. But um, but like you say, the fact is, like, I may have understood something more in it, or I've just considered something, differently in it, which makes me actually think, actually, do you know what? I didn't understand that before, and I do now, or I didn't think of it in that way before, and I do now. And to me, that's, that actually resonates with me more. So, yeah, I agree. I think criticism is going to be interesting, especially
Well,
when we get into our ratings.
yeah, we should do that in a minute. I also think that, I like what you're saying. We change. If we stop changing, we're dead, right? I don't ever want to
Yes.
be that old guy who's just like, yeah, I'm done. I don't
Yeah.
want to process new facts. But I also think that the culture changes and the moment changes. Starship Troopers has aged well, and it's
Mm.
aged well precisely because of current events. It has remained topical. If in 1998, 1 year after Starship Troopers, both of our countries decided to merge into one massive utopia,
Yeah.
Starship Troopers would seem dated in a way that it doesn't. Um, And it's not that elements of it don't seem dated. I think especially in these conversations, racial issues come out, but especially gender issues. It is amazing how many of these films have scenes that kind of make me, uh, you know, uh, hold my head and sort of, you know, crimp my eyes
Yeah,
and wince in pain at just a like, oh, why does she say this line that's so sexist? That's just so
yeah.
traditional.
Well, it's weird. I mean, we come back to Starship Troopers quite a bit, and it's it is a I will acknowledge it's a daft sci-fi sort of like militaristic adventure and all sort of stuff. But again, like you said, you can take so much from it. It's so relevant, but also it's sort of like its sexual politics are quite clear as well. That like we go back to we mentioned it in our review, but in the shower scene where they're all sort of showering together, like there is no gender in this. Like they don't. It's not. There's no. You know, at no point are men better than women. The sports teams are sort of unisex. The military has got no sort of like qualms about it. It's not an issue in this film. Like it has a very attractive male and female cast, and there's obviously the love triangle sort of elements of it which are typical. But for the most part, like gender is a non-issue in this film. Um, in a sci-fi film, but as I say, when you go back to others, I mean, some of the earlier films as well, we sort of highlighted how sort of rapey Blade Runner gets.
Yeah, and
and
I had not seen that. I had never, I mean, I had seen that it was problematic or whatever, but it never like set off just alarm bells, klaxons going in my head where I'm like,
yeah,
what am I watching a rape? I mean, you know, that sort of emergency light wasn't flashing in past viewings.
yeah. So, and that's the thing, like you do identify new things and sort of and again, um, the gender politics of Forbidden Planet from 1956 are quite it's there on the screen that they're sort of like they see the woman in the film as sort of like lesser. Is she sort of like she's a bit of a daft sort of like eye candy for the majority of the film.
Yeah,
There to be
I
sort of a damsel in distress.
That's true, and I think when we discuss that, it has this odd thing that a lot of films from the era have, and even films today have, where there is a sort of positive, smart female character who even is a role model in certain respects, right? Intelligent,
Mm,
independent, not embarrassed about sexuality, all this. But the moment a woman falls in love, she just
yeah,
wants to go, barefoot and pregnant and cook turkeys all day and just like becomes a different character overnight. Like this is just a well-established fact about female psychology. That seems to be what a lot of movies, including even today,
mm,
where you have characters where the writers do a good job. I mean, today they're very conscious of wanting to present that kind of stronger female character, but then it comes to the point where, yeah, we need Spider-Man to rescue Mary Jane again,
mm.
so she's gonna make some stupid mistake and get captured, and then she's gonna be the damsel in distress. And so there is this kind of like reversion to old tropes.
Yeah, it sounds like they try to get away from it, but it's always we're not quite there yet. We're not quite there. It's taken 56. You're talking sort of 70 or sort of 60 plus years. So maybe one day. So is it worth us then getting into our ratings of these 10 films?
Oh yeah, I can't wait to sort of see what we think and also why we think it. The difference between like how do you rate for fun versus
Yeah,
it being a good movie? Like some things are just really fun and some things are not fun but like not as enjoyable, but you think about it a lot more. Um,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Let's see. Let's sort of get and see how we go with this. So if we'll start from the beginning and work forward. So
ding, ding, ding,
our first
ding.
film.
The moment has
Yes, go back
come,
to
right?
this is it then. So let's see how we go with it. Forbidden Planet from 1956. So 1 to 10, then Julian. What are your thoughts on this? Where have you placed it?
Okay, this is going to be shocking. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
this the rest of my ratings, you will all see. I think I tend to be fairly tough, but I give Forbidden Planet a 9.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. What about you?
Uh, I gave it a 6.
Wow, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah. Why a 9? Because I know how much you like this film. I do know how much you enjoy this film.
Okay, so I mean, I think it is sort of impeccably made. I think it's
Mm,
very well structured. The special effects are great. It drags a little here and there in places, but it is it is the kind of thing that if it were on the telly, I would watch it. I would kind of be drawn to it, like RoboCop or Starship Troopers. It has that kind of like fun quality for me. But I think it's also just it's very well structured. I mean, we point out some questions, but I think it's just such a classic story that's just very well told, and it also has that fun aspect. It also has the special effects, and it has some deeper things to think about. So, and also it gets points, for being influential. That
mm.
um, it is seems so far ahead of its time in 56 and so influential on Star Trek. So for all those reasons, I think the fun aspect and the special effects nudge it up for me from maybe I would have already gone an 8 just for sort of how it's structured and it's got themes that resonate with me. So that's my explanation. Why a 6?
Uh, I I agree with what you're saying, and I do think part of this is uh, exposure to it at a specific time. So obviously, I had watched this a long time ago, but not really much. So coming back to it as an adult, I think I enjoyed it. Then I actually thought it was a good film. It's got some great moments. You say it's got some interesting themes, and for the most part, the cast are actually not too bad. Um, it just sort of it has some pacing issues, and I think that's that sort of original sort of Star Trek feel to it, which I would sort of say it's got that sort of a gentleness to it um, that is fine, but never really hooks me in. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like okay, the
Yeah.
stakes are fine, and I get what you're doing, and it has a nostalgia thing. Is I like watching it because it's a '50s film, and I do quite like that era. Um, but there's some bizarre sort of moments in it, like the use of an alien technology, and you sort of like they just whap it on their heads. It feels all it's a bit Prometheus for me, and that for that matter, I sort of like it feels aged. So I would probably go back and watch it, but I it's not one I would go to as a sort of as a go to, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I think all
Uh,
of that makes sense. I mean, I utterly see that justification. I mean, I think that
mm.
that's a completely fair rating. I don't know. I mean,
So
I just love it. And
it
I do
is.
and I do think it's structured well. I mean, for me, one of my biggest complaints about movies today, the kids and how they make these movies, is that like we've lost a sense of just basic writing
Mm,
structure. If you introduce this element early, it pays off. You don't have 4 villains in your superhero movie just to throw it in. Give me a damn structure that makes sense, that follows through, that knows what it's doing. And for me, you're right about everything you said. But I often go back to earlier works and and just admire the hell out of just the sheer quality of the writing on almost just a mechanical level. Um,
mm.
and I think that even watching like 50s TV shows, there's a lot of just mechanical good writing, that the story is told well in a way that even with good films from later periods, I often think, yeah, there's some awkward. Why did you tell it this way? I don't know.
No, I agree with what you're saying, and that is definitely one of the sort of the benefits of this. That it is I wouldn't say a small film by any stretch, but it's a sort of it's a well tailored story. And there's very little fat in it. It's quite sort of concise in its telling, which is good. Um, but I don't know. It just sort of feels almost constrained for that thing as well. Um,
True.
which is, I suppose, it isn't a bad thing. But yeah, it sort of it never gets the juices pumping in the same way, I think.
Yeah, fair enough. So,
So
you want to move on to Solaris,
yeah,
1971. So I went first on Forbidden Planet. How would you rate Solaris, Scott?
I gave Solaris a 5.
Wow,
Um,
that's awesome.
and I had to think about this one quite hard because I do think about Solaris. Um, it's one of those that sort of like in my head. I do think about Solaris, but then I sort of stopped myself and said, no, I don't think about Solaris. I think about the concept that it includes. The planet and the true alien sort of intelligence and everything that goes with it, and how it impacts the people on it. But that's about a third of the film. And I was thinking, okay, I really like that third of the film when it all goes a bit odd and a bit pear shaped, sort of, when he's on the space station and all that sort of stuff. Everything before it, I think the pacing's odd. I understand why certain things are there. Um, the whole driving scene seems to be sort of just there because they were there filming it, so put it in. And there's other bits like that it just sort of it. There's a really good story to tell, and I like the end result. But yeah, there's an awful lot of stuff that I'm just like, okay, I've got to wade through that, and that not even the fact it's Russian. That seems isn't really important, but I just think there's a lot to get through before you get to the good stuff.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think that also gets at it's not an enjoyable experience, right? Um, it is if you've got Solaris on the DVR, you're not gonna watch. I mean, I'm watching Family Guy every night of the week before I'm watching Solaris. Um, you need to devote that time, and even loving that film. So I gave Solaris an 8. um, but I would acknowledge that it is not fun. Now, I mean, I do find that it sticks in my memory, and I think that not only that idea of a truly alien intelligence, but also, um, his dead wife. A lot of those scenes with his wife and with the cast on that ship, I find very haunting and very beautifully composed. And incidentally, I was reading that I think I was reading about Kurosawa, and Kurosawa praised. He apparently Solaris was one of his favorite films, and he praised that driving sequence especially, and he said that it was like the most masterful sequence ever put on cinema or something like that, and you think that's crazy, right? Well, one of the things that I had forgotten about that is that um, Tarkovsky had to make it seem like it was a sci-fi landscape when it wasn't. He set up like all of these mirrors all along to mirror lights from other surfaces. So from a later time, here we are in 2020 looking at a 1971 film. We just think, oh, that's what Tokyo looks like. And
Mm.
if anything, it seems very 70s, right? It seems very
Yeah.
concrete and unimpressive. And we're like, why the hell are we getting 15 minutes of this car? But at the time, people like Kurosawa are seeing like this incredibly complex mirror work that's being done to make the city seem bigger and more futuristic than it really is. That was more evident at the time and now has been lost. So I don't know. I mean, I recognize Solaris isn't fun, but I find it a touchstone that I keep coming back to and love.
I wouldn't argue that it isn't fun. I mean, again, I break the film into these sort of sections, and I think, like, the bit I really do focus on and come back to is the second half, maybe the sort of the third act. Is, like I say, is all that stuff on the space station. Of once there, it's sort of, a lot of it's fantastic. The relationship with the two of the scientists on board. The relationship with his sort of his non-wife and her sort of, her sort of growth and realization of what she is. Even like the little things, so, when he actually sort of kills the first one, the first sort of like thing, and sort of sends her off into space or whatever. But you still find that the shawl that she was wearing is still on the chair, and those sorts of moments. Like, I remember those shots. I think it was, it's really well done. But I do feel like, it's it's that slog of getting through it. I mean, you know, the moment at the end of the film, sort of, when you see him in that sort of on Solaris, in that sort of version of that home he has in Russia, in the sort of the weirdness of it raining inside and all that stuff. It's sort of like, okay, I get now why they did those things at the beginning of the film, but it still took an awful lot to get there. So I don't think I'll ever really go back to it, but it's definitely something I'll remember watching. But yeah, I couldn't say. For me, it was. I think maybe I'm being tough, but yeah, it's one of those sort of, like I say, it has some fantastic and really good, interesting bits in it, but it was a slog to get to those things.
Yeah,
I tell. I'll tell you what it is. It's one of those films that sort of, because of all that stuff, it feels self-indulgent. Like the director's like, I've got this to do, and I can do this, and I can do that. And that thing about the mirror work is great. Technically, that sounds fantastic. Technically, but it doesn't contribute anything to the driving of the plot. And that's sort of where I'm like, do you know what I mean? It's like, okay, we didn't need
absolutely.
it.
You're 100% correct, right? I mean, I think that I was going to joke that what we have learned here is that having 40 minutes that are boring and that you want cut from the movie makes you ding your rating more than me. But yeah, I don't disagree. I guess, one of the things that I often think about in criticism is how we judge a work of art based on whether we judge it sort of for the average or based on its highest points or its lowest points. And there are movies that are really great that have. I mean, I think Forbidden Planet is great, but you can find low points in that movie that are just cringeworthy and painful. Obviously, for you, the 40 minutes of what have you made me watch, Julian? Drug that average down, right? I mean,
Yes.
if anything, you put a premium on that is just so low that the overall rating cannot be that great. And I acknowledge it's low, but I don't think that it's bad. I think it's still interesting. It might not be something I want to watch again, that portion, anytime soon, but it's not bad enough that it makes me ding the rating too much. But I also think the highs are so incredibly high that the highs for me are like 10 out of 10. And there's a lot of stuff that's 10 out of 10 here for me, just in terms of how it's done, how it's shot, what it means for those characters, what it means in terms of deeper philosophical issues about our connection to each other and, authenticity and things like that. So I often wonder about this, like, whether we're judging based on sort of the average of the work or privileging its highs and lows.
No, yeah, that's a good point. And I think if this had been, one of those films that sort of was, if you could split it into two halves, I think that, like you said, that first half would be lower quite a bit. Not. But that second half I'd probably be looking at you'd probably be looking at a 7, maybe a 7.5 for that second half, because I really do enjoy a lot of that stuff. but yeah, but there are even moments in that, like you say, where you're sort of like, yeah, okay, it's really good, this is really good, and then it drags itself, it sort of comes down again, and you're like, oh, you seem to be doing something that sort of just for the sake of it, it's a bit like maybe one day we'll get round to it that like 2001
Hmm.
is very similar in that um, it has moments of spectacle. Even the very opening of the film, the docking of the sort of the space station and stuff. It's a great spectacle, and maybe it just goes back to my attention span. But after a certain amount of minutes, I'm a bit like, I get the point. It's sort of the model works fantastic, but like, yeah. So I think it's sort of a bit of that, really. Maybe my millennial, early millennial attention span. I was ruined by Saturday morning cartoons. Um, okay,
MTV.
so
I
that
blame MTV.
yes, that's MTV ruined me. So that was Solaris. So now this was the real contention. So Star Wars, and when we say Star Wars, we have to be clear. This is 1977. It's a New Hope, Star Wars. So, what rating did you give A New Hope?
I give it a 6.
It's
And I
interesting actually because
not a
yeah,
surprise. Yeah.
no, and do you know what? Because obviously I reviewed this with you for this, and then obviously we discussed it when I discussed it when I did the overall retrospective with the other two other guys, and I sort of realised something about this film, and you'll be surprised. I'm holding back on my score because I think it's going to surprise you. I do like that original trilogy, um, but I've changed my mind on that. For many years I held this sort of thing of like, Empire Strikes Back is the best, and then it's Star Wars, and then it's Return of the Jedi, and that sort of thing. And sort of like it's cool to sort of like to rib on the to the Ewoks and stuff. Having watched it this time, and having watched it in the context of like the prequels and the sequels, A New Hope is the worst one of that trilogy, without a doubt.
Yeah. I agree with that.
And so I find that Empire Strikes Back is a really good film. I think there's some fantastic stuff in there, and
Mhm.
I think Return of the Jedi has got some great bits. It's just an all out sort of like balls to the wall, just fun. Like they really ramp up that sort of the space battles, and I mean, it's got real ridiculous plot holes in that as well. But so I sort of came down on this and gave it a 6.5.
Yeah. Wow.
And this score has dropped month on month recently. So I think I would have probably given this like a 7.5 and an 8. If
Mhm.
we'd have talked about this time last year, sort of early sort of 2019, I think I'd have been this has been a couple of points ahead.
Mhm.
But really getting into this, I struggled with the fact that sort of there's so much that sort of just doesn't make any sense. Everything from sort of characterization through to sort of time plot holes through to just a sort of space waffling that gets given into this film and everything. It is fine. It's a good pulpy fun adventure, but yeah, it's not as good as I think its sort of reputation would have you think.
Yeah, I
Have I left you?
admire
Have I left?
that.
I thought I'd left you speechless for a moment then.
Well, yeah, I mean, so my thinking is, a 6 is slightly better than average. So, my
Mm,
thinking is, I mean, Star Wars is fun. I mean, it's painful for me, but there are, obviously McQuarrie's work is brilliant. So, to me, a 6 is sort of in line with, um, stuff that's fun. It doesn't have anything really deep to offer. It's not like an impeccably done fun ride that might get up to a 7 or maybe a little higher if it's perfectly done or something. But so to me, like a 6 is an honorable score that says this is fun. It's definitely visual sort of feast. It's definitely music. It's got things going for it. Not a great movie. Not trying
mm,
to be a great movie. But uh, yeah, I mean it's better than average. Um, and I think that so to me, I think a 6 is makes sense in that context for
Mm.
me. Um, and that helps to sort of like put it in that category of, yeah, this is a fun movie, but it's a lot closer to say Flash Gordon than you know Citizen Kane.
Yes. Yeah. It just yeah, and that's it. It is good fun. I mean, like you say, the sort of the trench run at the end of the film on the Death Star is really well done. Like the special effects work and the model work is really good. Um, and some of the characters are good, but it's one of those films that sort of the more you dig, the more sort of like inconsistencies are sort of like I understand that things can be refined and that sort of thing, but even the sort of like the skill of and power of a Jedi is all over the place in this film, and sort of from the use of sort of and we said it in the review, like everything from the use of sort of the sort of Jedi mind trick through to the ability to move things with it's just all over the place. But more than the one thing that sort of struck me more than anything in this film is Luke is just not a very nice person. I just decide
Quite so.
he's a whiny brat who the people that have cared for him for 19 years, he sort of mourns them for all of 20 minutes. And then this old bloke in a sort of a cape who he's known for all of, an hour or so. When he dies, he's sort of like he's really broken up about it. And I'm like, you've got some real emotional problems. So, yeah.
Yeah, and all Luke
Um,
does is whine to Uncle Ben. Those
yeah.
people who have taken care of him. He's like, yeah, you've taken care of me, but I want to go off and do these things, and they want him to, but he is just kind of whiny. I never really I never really liked him that much growing up. I think it's interesting that people like we love Han Solo, right? But
Mm.
nobody really likes Luke, right?
No,
And
no.
he's cool, he's the main character, but people don't really, you want to be him because you want his powers, right? And you want to
Mm.
be the hero, but yeah, he's just not that likable.
No, no. So yeah, so this last sort of couple of months has been a revelatory period for me in Star Wars. Um,
Well, Julian Darius ruining fun since 1976.
well, let's see how we get on with the rest of the
Okay,
films. So,
so
so
yeah, so I'll have you go first on this Blade Runner, Ridley Scott from 1982. What's your rating?
so Blade Runner. This was yeah. I actually I gave this an 8. Um, because this film again it has some problems, but um, with this film I think we just talked about Han Solo and stuff, and I like Harrison Ford. I don't think he's the greatest actor of all time, but I really enjoy Harrison Ford and things. But there's just something about this film that I get really pulled into. So every time I watch it, sort of like it's that sort of like um, sort of noir, sort of cyberpunk sort of feel to it all, and sort of that just it's. I don't know. There's just something about this film that I really, really enjoy. I think the characters are great. I think sort of the concept of replicants is really interesting, and the way they get treated. I like the fact that this took us down to that sort of conversation around slavery and almost like workers' rights. Um, but yeah, aesthetically, there's just something about this film I really enjoy, and I just find the sort of the ambiguity around some of the plot points as well. Sort of just keep me. I can go back to this film again and again, um, and sort of that question around sort of is Deckard a replicant, yes or no, and also the sort of thing of like what what is the relationship between Deckard and Rachel? Like, is it love? Is it infatuation?
Hmm.
Is it just one of sort of mutual sort of survival? Um, I just find all of it really interesting, actually.
Yeah, I
So,
agree
what's your thoughts?
all of that. I also gave it an 8.
Hmm.
And I think, what's curious to me is how my perception of this film has changed over time. And I think that it's actually lowered over time. I think that Blade Runner is often seen as sort of no doubt a 9 or a 10, right? I mean, it's kind of revered almost as like the quintessential sci-fi film with something to say, and it's deep and about humanity and what's real and who's real, and all that stuff is there, and obviously aesthetically unbelievably influential. I do think it's slow.
Mm,
I think that it doesn't have 40 minutes like Solaris, but I mean, I do think it's slow. Um, I don't think that there's certainly I don't think most of the acting is fantastic. I think that it is usually overrated, and that it
mm,
has flaws that most people don't acknowledge. Um, but it does have obviously incredibly influential, beautiful. You think about it, there's so much to enjoy, and at this, but especially in our conversation, watching it this time and talking about it with you, we were able to really see a lot of flaws and a lot of stuff that just does not make sense. Um,
mm.
and at the same time acknowledge how beautiful it is, how influential it is, and get into all of these deep questions, which I love thinking about and talking about and are there in the film. But I don't know that the film is really in control of itself, and it has some kind of flaws that aren't usually acknowledged by the Blade Runner's brilliant crowd.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. I think there are it definitely has problems, and I agree that pacing is one of them. But in contrast to sort of Solaris, it's pacing, but within a sort of a much shorter runtime, and so those sort of slumps I think are shorter. And um, I think one of the things you said before is about those the lows and the highs. Um, and I do think that the highs of this film are really sort of there's the reason it's so influential. Sort of they stand out. Um, but there are still moments that are completely daft. There's sort of the things that don't work, and sort of Roy Batty's sort of breakdown at the end of the film. There are moments in that are just plain head scratching. Um, but yeah, there's just something like this I can go back to again and again, and sort of and I think the fact that the director, the fact that Ridley Scott went back to this multiple times to refine it, sort of goes to show that yeah, there is something here that that warrants that sort of attention. And so you've said it's sort of come down. I think this has sort of come up for me in my estimation. Because I think you're right. When I watched this as a kid or when I was younger, I think its slow pace did bother me. Um, because I was expecting, because the poster and sort of parts of it, sort of when it's portrayed, I'm expecting something a bit more action packed.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually sort of now that I'm older, I actually appreciate that slower pace and sort of the fact it does sort of like tap into that sort of like 30s noir sort of Sam Spade sort of aesthetic. Um, and so yeah, no, I think this has probably gone up a point or so with me in the last couple of years.
Yeah, sounds good.
So moving from from future replicants then to body horror, and 1986 is The Fly. So let's see, where are you with that?
So I gave it a 7.
Mm,
And my thinking there is, okay, it's better than Star Wars, right?
yeah,
It has something to say, but it's not sort of in that flawed classic uh, territory of the eights of a Solaris or a Blade Runner. It seems clear to me it's between Star Wars and Blade Runner. And in the case of The Fly, I mean, this was one of the films that I sort of changed my opinion on, or I found myself um, confronting again. I hadn't seen it for years, and my memory of it was like, yeah, I liked it, but I was a kid, you know.
yeah,
I liked tons of stuff that was just entertaining, and guy turns into a fly, and I mean, the plot is absurd, right? So in memory, I
mm,
remember like, yeah, Jeff Goldblum, everybody likes him. Who gives a shit? Teleporter accident turns a man into a fly. Like, yeah, it's doing what it's doing fine, but I didn't think that I'd go back to it and think it was so gripping and just so well done. And and talking about it with you really aided me in that. And so I think The Fly has gone up in my estimation,
Mm.
and I gave it a 7. What about you?
For me, I'll say this is another 8.
Mhm.
And I do think that maybe that was sort of part of because it influences me. It's one of those films I watched probably younger than I should have been. But there is so much in this film, and I found it's quite short, it's quite punchy, and it is absurd. I mean, we talked about it, the notion of this sort of almost like rogue scientist being able to create these teleportation pods in his bedroom, pretty much, and being funded by this sort of this science company, and also the fact that there seems to be a science magazine with an endless budget. But I don't know, yeah, just the idea of this sort of this idea of sort of the potentiality of technology and sort of this sort of drive forward. I mean, if this had gone well, Brundle would have been up there with people like Bill Gates and Tesla and all those sorts of Elon Musk and that sort of thing. He's this sort of kooky genius, and so and the performance of Jeff Goldblum in this film, from that sort of quirky, uh, boring sort of scientist guy to the Fly, to Brundle Fly by the end, is so well done. He's sort of he's so engaging throughout it all. Yeah, I just find there's a lot in this, and sort of there are moments in this film that again I know are silly, but they're actually a lot of it's handled really, really well. Like when he finally loses it and goes out to the bar and sort of breaks a guy's arm, and I don't know. I just I'm invested in that film, but also the ideas that come up in it as well. So the idea when he has a conversation with Gina Davis, he sort of says, "You ever heard of a fly politician?" Well,
Mhm.
no, there isn't one, because the law of the sort of the jungle, the law of the insect world is kill or be killed. So that's what I'm becoming. So you may want to run, sort of thing. Um, it's really interesting. It's another tragic sort of science story. So I don't know. Yeah, for me, it does sort of sit up there as that sort of like it crosses two worlds as well for me. It's sort of there's the horror, and I've obviously got my love of horror as well as my love of science fiction. It sort of crosses those two worlds and marries them up, which to me sort of like it's a double win for me. So I think that's one of the reasons I hold it quite high, actually.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. And, 7 and 8 were pretty close there.
Mm,
I think one of the things you said that resonates with me is about its runtime. Um,
mm,
and, that's very true. I mean, I think that there's a great place for movies that are shorter. They do what they do. They do what they do really well. They get in, they
mm,
get out. And here again, there's a sort of question of like, well, how do you judge that? I think for me, The Fly, is closer to something like sort of James Whale's Frankenstein, which I hope we'll talk about at some
mm,
point, where it's short, it's doing what it's doing really well, it's kind of got some classic images that stick with you that are great, um, and it's got some deeper themes that I agree that's there. The performance is brilliant in The Fly, but ultimately I feel like it gets in, it tells this story really well, not perfectly but really well, and it gets out. And the point is sort of like to entertain you with these deeper messages, and it does it really well, but it doesn't sort of like transcend for me to uh something that either is just so impeccable or so deep, um, that I'm going to come back to it again and again, like Solaris or something.
mm. I understand that. I can appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting one because I think it's also very 80s. And I think that sort of um, again, like you say, I think it's when you come to sometimes when you come to a film, it's sort of like it can obviously influence what you can take from it. Um, which is also obviously is also important, actually relevant to the next film. Um, so Akira from 1988. Um, is it my turn? Am I going first for this one? I've lost track.
Well, it would be. it would be my turn, I think, because if you introduce it, I give the rating first. But if you want to go first, I don't care.
I can't remember. I
Kung
can't
Tu
remember if
Fu.
you gave the first one for that. Yeah. Well, let's just go for it then. Yeah, so I just sort of jumped on for that one. So I gave Akira a 7. Because again, I think it's obviously incredibly influential. Um, it's influenced an awful lot of films. It sort of introduced um, Japanese animation, really, in many respects, to the West. Um, it looks great. I mean, this is it's sort of the what do you call it? The sort of cell rate on it is was revolutionary. They used it's sort of like 47 cells a second to try and make it look more like sort of fluid animation and fluid sort of filming. And I just I think again it's one of those I think sort of the sort of the a lot of it's nonsense. I mean, this is it's a very sort of odd story, but it just for me, I just sort of you get invested in it. You've got the ideas for the future of Neo Tokyo, the biker gangs, and then just the idea that it's kids that are actually this isn't sort of two adults trying to take this on. This is just two petulant kids fighting this out on a really big sort of playground. And I just find that whole thing sort of really interesting. So yeah, no, to me it's a solid 7.
Well,
What about
I
you?
gave it a 6.
Mm,
And so to me, I mean, those are both pretty close. I agree with everything you said. I think that to me, it's basically Star Wars.
mm,
I it's not to me, it's not as good as The Fly. Um, and I think that it seems very similar to Star Wars in several respects. I mean, it was very influential. It's visually kind of stunning, right? Um, it has this look to it that people remember certain bits of it, and they remember things like the motorcycle more than they do some of the haphazard plot elements. I think the plot of Akira is almost as much of a mess as the plot of Star Wars. But I think it's a little less fun, honestly. Star Wars is a little more watchable to me. There are sequences in Akira that are brilliant that I could watch on repeat, but there are other sequences where I'm like, this makes no sense. This is really stupid. Get back to that car, get back to
yeah.
the bike driving around. I want to see that. And I think that my takeaway from it is really beautiful, really influential. And but uh ultimately vapid, and what's important are these brilliant sequences. Like, what's important about Star Wars is the lightsaber and Darth Vader and these kinds of iconic visuals.
Yeah.
So I think they're very similar to me in that respect.
No, that's a good point. I agree with what you're saying. Um, and again, I think that's my set. I said before about sort of like it's a strong whatever. I think this is sort of like a 7 in that sort of like I do really like this. I think it's got some things to it, but like you say, I could easily be swayed on if I was in a different mood, I could probably be swayed a little bit to sort of to drop that down, or maybe even maybe go the way that I don't know, but yeah.
All of these
So that's
ratings are subject to change. We would
yes.
never come up with these same ratings exactly the same way ever again. Uh,
No, this is also a moment in time. Um, but the
so
next one's going to be
Starship
interesting. The
Troopers
next one,
97,
yeah.
Paul Verhoeven. I gave this a 7, and this was interesting. I think this has actually come down in my estimation. I think that if I had
Mm,
to rate it a year ago, I would have given it an 8 or maybe even a 9. Um, more clearly in that territory. And I think, it's ironic because we had this podcast about it in which the two of us just raved about it and it just had so much fun talking about it. But it also brought out to me like how soap operatic it is, how,
mm,
and how, I mean, I was going to say, Blade Runner slow. What it really needs is a 15-minute, flying car sequence. Um, Starship Troopers has, I mean, that whole like sort of first 40 minutes is really a, sort of sci-fi version of 90210. And
Mm.
and I was amazed by how, watching it again, by how much of the stuff that I liked is further and further toward the end of the film. And even once they start fighting, it's like, this is good. I remember all of this. I've thought about this stuff again. The stuff that's most sticks in my mind is like that final act. That final 25 minutes is the best of the film to me.
Mm.
Or the last half hour or whatever. And so I guess those sort of like campy elements, the ways in which, like, it's not as good as RoboCop, as far as Verhoeven stuff. Or, so I don't know. For me, it's a 7.
I actually gave it a 7 as well, but I actually was verging on a 6.5. But I think I went for a 7 because of that enjoyment factor, and I agree with everything you've just said. In that, like you say, it does do a really good job of satirizing the sort of the military and sort of weirdly predicting sort of like clickbait media. And the cast, I think the cast are pretty good in the sense of like they do what they're supposed to do. I think they're supposed to be, like you say, that sort of soap opera-y, chiseled good looks kind of sort of cast. But like I said, it sort of it's fun, but it does have like dips. It really does sort of like it's trying to be sort of a sci-fi Full Metal Jacket and doesn't quite make it. In some cases, I mean, it is a brilliant film. It's really good fun. Like we kept saying, it does stand up. Like, you can still watch this and really enjoy it and take things from it. But the fact is, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's not as good as RoboCop. And to me, I think RoboCop's probably one of Paul Verhoeven's best. Like, I really enjoy that film. I love RoboCop, and we will get to that, I think, one day. And so the satire in this sort of is good. It's fun. It's taken on the military rather than big corporations. But it never feels as cutting or as, it's RoboCop feels like it's really going for the jugular with a lot of things. This sort of feels like it's poking somebody in the ribs. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're both doing a good job, but it's not quite as sort of intensely trying to sort of satirize what it's supposed to be satirizing, which is possibly studio interference. But yeah, that's sort of where I think it could have been a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned structure, in talking about Forbidden Planet, and I am such a sucker for a well-structured story, and partly what I like about Starship Troopers is how crazy and out of control it is, and how much it throws out the rules of how you're supposed to write this stuff or even have a conclusion. But part of that chaos is also that it's not as tight. It's not as in control of itself. And I think RoboCop, I agree with you. We both love that film. RoboCop is much more in control. There's no moment where, I mean, there are moments of like gore or something, but there's no moment where like all of a sudden a guy's eyeball falls out for no reason, and it's like suddenly Ray Harryhausen film for a minute, where you just think that doesn't tonally belong with that movie. And Starship Troopers is doing that all the time. And I think that if I were to rate Starship Troopers for fun, it's a 9 for me. It's so much fun. Every time that's on TV, I'm gonna kind of stop what I'm doing and watch it. But it does have these flaws, and it's not controlled as a narrative, as a display of a world.
Mm. No, I'd agree with that. I do. Yeah, I think there's things that were taken from the original source material that sort of like they seem to have kept odd things that make no sense, as we said, sort of like that they're all living in Buenos Aires, yet they're all clearly from California. Like that,
Yeah.
that makes no sense at all. It's almost like a nod to the book that doesn't need to be there. So yeah, I agree with that. That's not to say it's sort of. I feel like I'm still trying to defend it, but it's still a really good film.
It's definitely fun. I mean, going back to like how we rank these things, I mean,
Mm.
its fun score is higher for me. Okay, so what do you think about Primer, 2004? I
Primer. So
know
this was
you like this less than I did.
I did. I actually gave this a 6. And actually, from our conversation, since our conversation, like I haven't watched the whole thing, but I went back and I wanted to check a couple of things. So I have sort of skipped in and sort of watched some bits, mainly around the sort of the time travel elements of how it's sort of laid out and sort of feeds into the finale. Um, so yeah, it's it's a film that is so structured, and you have to be prepared for. I think it does sort of benefit multiple viewings, and I think that it does have something to say. I love the fact that it is like a well thought out and well considered approach to time travel. The whole notion of how it all works and that is fantastic. And I quite like the payoff at the end of how it sort of it seems to be using. They've been using it then to sort of manipulate these different bits and pieces. But it's almost like a better director, like say Christopher Nolan, which we'll get on to, would do this, and you get something like Memento, or you get something that you go, oh my god, that's really well done. That's sort of you get something from it. And to me, I think it's sort of this film is too subtle in some respects, too downplayed, and so you have to work way too hard to get everything from it, which is a shame because I think there is a lot here. Whereas I think sort of there's a balance there to give into that sort of entertainment value to try and bring it out a little bit more. So yeah, it fell short for me. What
Yeah,
about
fair
you?
enough. I gave it an 8.
Mm.
I think that, I mean, I think it's I agree with I actually agree with all of that. I think, um, I think that it's pretty impeccably well done. It's staggering how much they accomplished on that small budget. I think that there is, and I think it's a kind of classic. I mean, I think that um, you know, it's probably, in a relatively short list of the best sci-fi movies ever made. Maybe not in the top 10, but certainly, the top 25 or so. Um, it does have its flaws, and I think you're right. And I think that, like, there's a version of Solaris that you would like better, and frankly I would like better, where not necessarily another director took over, but another editor took over and chopped 30 minutes out. Just condensed some stuff. Certainly made it 20 minutes, made it move faster. There's a version of Primer that had more money and that
Yes.
extended that last sort of 20 minutes or so by probably another 20 minutes, and that had more money and had more time to do this stuff, and maybe to signal how brilliant it is underneath, just a little better, just to give you a little more of that sort of like Chris Nolan, like, thump, like,
Yes.
here's the twist, I'm getting it. And because this is so low budget and down to earth, it has an aesthetic that works for me, but it doesn't necessarily bring you along with its
Mm.
narrative in an optimal way.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that's the sort of thing. If this had some extra money, I mean, not even like a great deal of money. Like say, what was the budget? It was like ridiculously low, wasn't it? Like in the tens of thousands of pounds. Was it?
Yeah, exactly.
Like you say, just a little bit more. Like they could have expanded on it, and I think that would definitely make the film more accessible, which would probably raise the rating a little bit.
Well, look forward to the Michael Bay reboot in 2031.
That's, yeah.
Primer.
yeah,
Now with
yeah,
motorcycles.
explosions every 30 seconons, like no reasons, just an explosion.
Dude,
Uh,
you didn't tell me you were going back in time already.
The other thing is, of course, you're saying as if they'd be human. They wouldn't. They'd either be mutants or robots. So it would probably be a very. In fact, I'm not surprised if they didn't actually just use this as a Transformers film at some point in the future. Optimus Primer.
Oh, there you go. That's good.
Yeah.
I like that.
Okay, so we're going to jump forward again, and we sort of now we mentioned Nolan. So here we have it then. Inception, 2010. What were your thoughts on Inception?
I give it an 8.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a bunch of films that have gotten an 8. And to me, if anything, Inception kind of also lowered a little bit in our discussion. And it's interesting to me, like sort of how it's fluctuated. I think when I first saw it in theaters, I thought, yeah, it's not Dark Knight, it's not The Prestige. Um, I really liked it. I thought visually it was probably, better than those films. Um,
Mm.
but but the plot kind of, irritated me, and there was some sort of like uncontrolled aspects of it that I didn't like. And then over time in the years since 2010, it's sort of increased in my mind, and I sort of have found it. No, it's on par with the best of Nolan, and that love story and those characters have really stayed with me and stuck with me and meant a lot to me. But watching it and talking about it with you, I felt more of those plot holes. I mean, there's just so much that you have to accept about the
Mm.
dreams and and all of this, and there are some sort of like uncontrolled elements, like it wants the ending to be ambiguous, but there's kinds of some question of like, well, it can't really be one way, it can't really be the other. I think it's a great movie. I think it's visually stunning. I think it's got brilliant ideas. I think it's a can't miss kind of sci-fi important work, but it does have these flaws that kind of have lowered it, maybe in my mind, to an 8. What about you?
I I think like yourself. I think sort of I jumped around again on this one. I ended on a 6.5 because exactly of what you just said. Sort of, I think the human element of this film is actually quite good. I think the thread that runs through it, and the thing I picked up in, and I mentioned in our review, was this idea of it feels like a haunted film. Sort of um, Marianne Cotillard's character, sort of like she's this sort of like the haunting in this sort of thing that sort of pops up and will influence things and all this other stuff. And I like that sort of the closer you go through his, or the deeper you go through his sort of dream worlds, the subconscious, the more influence she has, which resonates with his guilt and all this other stuff. And I like the ideas, sort of the concept of it. But then, like you say, it's one of those things that you start to scratch away, and it sort of starts to make no sense. And
Yeah.
it's sort of like, we said about the technology. Okay, that would work in the real world. Then why? But why have they got to have it in every other sort of dreamscape? And why has it got to have someone then look after it? And why has it got this? And I like the sort of the idea, this notion of being able to sort of steal ideas, but then it's trickier to plant an idea. And again, it's sort of like so the themes and ideas it's presenting are actually really interesting, and they're actually really good. But it's almost like they've sort of focused so much on that they've gone, okay, well, no one's really going to notice this other bit, so let's just crack on. And so it's sort of, there are bits that sort of feel. I would never say Christopher Nolan's lazy. That's wrong, but it feels some sort of like almost like painted over. Sort of like, I'll just ignore that, sort of roll on that sort of like, and that to me is disappointing. And again, I've got no problem with an ambiguous ending. I'm quite happy with an ambiguous ending. But the fact that this film has been centered around this tragedy, this sort of this thing that's happened to the Cobb, the Carrier's character, to then give it this sort of ambiguous ending at the end, sort of feel unsatisfying, because maybe it's just me because what we got onto with Looper, sort of maybe I'm just a soft git. I don't know, but like this idea of him, maybe he didn't get home to his kids, and maybe that was sort of it just feels a bit sort of like okay, so why have I been invested in this then? Like surely there should be some sort of like payoff, like and so maybe I think that he does get home to his children, but then sort of. And they want to cast doubt, and I'm almost like, "Oh, you bastard!" That feels like a real sort of cheap shot. So I don't know. It is a good film, and I think again visually it's really interesting. But again, it's one of those things. I had a problem. We sort of talk about with I forget her name's character, Juno. What's the bloody name?
Yeah.
It's just sort of her character, this idea of the architect and stuff. And again, it's like, okay, that's a really good idea. That's really interesting. Let's explore that. No, she's just there for this and this and this. And it's sort of like, it's some parts of it just feel like you need people there for certain things and sort of, so it's not a bad film by any stretch. I think it's a very well done film, and as Nolan produces more and more films, I don't know if it's in his top half at times because I think he's done better films, but it's still good. So yeah, to me, 6.5 seems fair.
Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with that. I had to look it up. Ellen Page is her name.
That's it, Ellen Page. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I'm not bothered by. I like the ambiguous ending. I'm not bothered by kill those kids. I mean, I don't have sort of the same instincts there. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's that sort of point that you made. I mean, about how why does this wake you up? Why do you need this technology in the next level of the dream? That you really helped kind of disassemble some of these things that I saw already, but that like the sheer not just that it's the setup of the world that they're establishing. Like you have to accept certain rules, right? Aliens have invaded, whatever, they have this technology, whatever, you have to accept that. But it's the fact that even within that, there are those things of like, why do you have the architect? Why do you need this technology? And I think that you have been very good at pointing those out. And I think it's exactly those things that have lessened this film in my memory.
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's true. But I still love it. Obviously, I gave it an 8, right? I mean, I still love it.
It's funny, but technology seems to be one of the sort of the hampering factors because it's the same sort of thing that comes up in Looper, isn't it? Sort of in Inception, they've got this technology that allows them to enter somebody's dream, and it's never really explained. It's just a silver briefcase with some tubes coming out of it. But this sort of this idea of sort of like, if this is a real thing, then surely, as we sort of said about the military influence across sort of all these films, like surely someone should be doing something pretty important with this technology. Like, surely there must be presidents and prime ministers and world leaders must have some serious subconscious defenses in place. Do you know what I mean? That sort of thing to prevent, excuse me, the potential of inception, or even just what trade secrets or world, national security secrets being leaked. And so you sort of think, okay, so why have they got this technology then? Surely this must be hugely confidential. And the same thing sort of happens in Looper, which we'll get onto now, I suppose.
So Looper, 2012, Rian Johnson.
Yeah, it's the same thing with the technology there. It's sort of like you've got this. They acknowledge in the film that the technology's been banned. So why the hell have criminal gangs got it? It's a massive sort of jumping point you've got to get over, I suppose. But let's get to Looper. It's a 10. Let's be honest. It's I gave this film a 7. And I acknowledge that sort of like, as we sort of said in our review, sort of like the time travel stuff makes no sense. Like, it completely throws out the idea of causality, and anything else. It sort of, the paradoxes that this thing would sort of introduce is off the charts. It makes no sense. But there are still elements of this film for some reason I sort of just seem to really enjoy. I think Joseph Gordon-Levitt's really good in it. But the thing I really like is the idea of being in conflict with a different version of yourself, older or younger, and this thing of sort of like this is this idea of this is the trajectory that you are on, and we can change that, but we have to make this decision. And then and not being able to do that, I find that really interesting. And so yeah, no, I think 7. I think again, I'm trying to sort of I'm going to try and defend it again, but like I say, it's just to me this is that character piece that I go back to the conversation in the diner that they have where they literally sort of say like don't bother thinking about the sort of like the way it works because we're not going to. Yet those conversations and the idea of sort of the impact of doing something can have on the future, that sort of like the ripple effect of things. Sort of I get quite into that with this film. So yeah, no, I think it's quite a comfortable 7.
Well,
What
I
about
gave it
you? What were your
a,
thoughts?
I gave it a 0. I know we said 1 to 10, but
Yeah.
no, I gave it a 4.
Mm.
For all the things that we discussed. And I think, what's really interesting to me is sort of the way we're kind of like both hypocrites. Like,
Yes.
Inception is my Looper, right? And I think
Yes.
Inception doesn't have that level of problems, but, in its defense, but it definitely, I mean, told Inception a new orifice with your mad logic skills, uh, and and I think what it comes down to for both of us is that we acknowledge these things, but they bother us less. Or at the end of the day, like Inception is for me 90% of the time pretty damn gripping. And
Mm.
Looper is sort of like tacitly interesting and has one kind of exciting sequence, and then I'm phenomenally bored. And I think that that just what we prefer and what we find fun and engaging makes the difference. That we really in objective terms see these two films pretty similarly, but
Mm.
we respond to them subjectively very differently.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Sort of like say how we approach these films. Um, I like I like your comment that sort of yes, that we both have these films that have flaws and we're happy to acknowledge them. However, I will still hold on to the fact that for some reason it brings, as I didn't come back to it, it brings me joy. But yeah, I think in the discussion we sort of said about for me it's the character study of this and some of the sort of the potential to redeem and to change is just I've just got a soft spot for that kind of rubbish, to be honest. It's one of those. It's why I read sort of it's one of those great things about comics, isn't it? That sort of this idea of redemption and what did Stan Lee call it? The illusion of change.
Yes.
So yes, so I think it's interestingly I think you say there are other side. I agree. I definitely agree that there are more plot holes and issues of what we say technology in Looper than in Inception. I am more willing to accept Inception's dream technology than I am Looper's time travel technology, which and also like I say the way time travel seems to work in the film has no common sense. And I always like the fact that going back to Primer, Ryan Johnson contacted the writer and director of Primer and sort of told him what he was doing with Looper. and what's his, I don't know if his name, the guy who created Primer, basically said, that's not how time travel works. And Ryan Johnson was just like, it is in my film. And it's sort of like he completely acknowledges that it doesn't make sense, but it provides for some visually interesting scenes, which I acknowledge are frustrating and silly. But yeah, I don't know.
Well,
It's just
I admire that he, that he can say, yeah, it doesn't make sense, but this is what I want to do. Um, it gets back to the like admitting, both of us being able to admit, like, yeah, I mean, Inception has these major problems, um, and it does get back to subjectivity. It does get back to emotion, and
Hmm.
Inception breaks my heart. Inception moves me. It's not even that it's fun. I mean, I'm such an emotional masochist, but Inception just it breaks my heart. There are shots of that sort of bottom. They
Mm.
call it um, limbo,
Yes.
where you just see that shot of limbo and that bass plays, and I think there's something about a stunning visual with stunning audio that means something emotionally to me in that story, that it's like all audiovisual and significance are kind of like all overlapping in the Venn diagram, and making something that just feels so perfect to me as both
Mm.
audio, as this sort of like audio visual feast that I'm engaging in, that also kind of breaks my heart and messes
Yeah.
with my head, and makes me think about relationships, and Looper doesn't do that for me. But we're both right. These, what's interesting is, although these are subjective emotional responses, that stuff is there in Looper, and it's
Mm.
absolutely there, and that stuff that is there, it works for you in a way that it doesn't for me. But I can't deny that it's there, and I can't deny that that is the redemption of that film, and that stuff is objectively there. It just works for you in a way that it doesn't for me.
Yeah, and I think there's things to acknowledge. I mean, I actually, um, I think Ryan Johnson is an interesting director. I always think his films make interesting choices, whether they be good or bad. I really like Brick. I think Brick is an incredibly interesting film. Um, doesn't always work in the way that I think he intends it to work. Um, and same with Last Jedi. I think Last Jedi is a very well made film, but I think it doesn't quite work in what he's intended. Um, and so I would acknowledge that I think Nolan is definitely a more masterful director. But there's just something about his films that I do sort of that does sort of work for me as well. Uh, so
Well,
yeah, but
what's interesting is, so I usually think of myself as, and people tell me that I'm a tough critic, that like consistently my ratings are, a point or two below other people.
mm,
And I think you have been a tougher critic on this first season than I have, which astounds me, Scott. I mean, you get a special merit badge in my book for that.
I am one mean mother. That's what it is.
From outer space.
And that's another one we're gonna do one day. I love that film.
Oh, me too.
Uh, but that's it. Really. That's us looking back at season one. This is our first season, really. I'm really proud of what we've done with this. I think it's been a real journey, and I mean, what do you think? Are you pleased with what we've done?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, it has been such a joy for me doing this. And when you first suggested doing this, I had been on 20th Century Geek and enjoyed our podcast very much, and sort of had a rapport with you, and really felt very simpatico. But you sort of proposed this out of left field, and I thought, okay, that's ambitious. What are we going to do? And then I really got into it, and it really feels like our own, and
Mm.
I think that we have grown in our rapport and our understanding of each other, and the way we approach film. And I've learned about every single one of these films by talking with you about it, and I think that that's amazing. And I also think that the sheer joy that I have had revisiting these films and discussing them, and doing this with you, recording this every couple weeks, has been just a great thing. And there are weeks where I think, oh, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. Oh shit, I got to watch Akira in the next 2 days. Uh, but and maybe I enjoy watching it, or maybe I don't. Maybe that varies. But when I talk to you, and when we have these discussions, these sort of jam sessions of ideas, it makes my day. And the whole rest of my day, it's earlier here than it is there. So the whole rest of my day is a great day, because I feel like I've done something. We've shared our thoughts. We've got another episode in the bag, and I just have enjoyed that discussion and thinking about it. And I feel so comfortable talking with you about it and sharing these things and being able to be honest about it. So I hope that joy comes out, and I hope that if the audience enjoys it half as much as I do, it will mean a whole lot to them.
No, I have to echo that, because I agree. Like I say, it's always a bit later here, just because of the time differences. But it's it's one of those, after recording, I have to go and like mellow out, because these sessions, these sort of, like I say, I love the idea. It's like a sci-fi jam session. Um, it gets me sort of like, gets my brain pumping. It gets my sort of like, my synapses firing, and it sort of it's, some of the ideas we come up with and some of the thoughts we come up with, they stick with me, and they do. They sort of, I can talk to other things, and it sort of gets me onto other ideas and other things we can do, and ideas and stuff. So it's I really enjoy doing this, and it's an absolute joy and an absolute pleasure, an honor to be doing this with you. So I'm so glad our season 1 has been a success, really. But we're not a one hit wonder. We're not going to be a one hit wonder. We're not sitting on our laurels. We have got other things lined up, and we've got some bonus material as well coming out. We are going to take, obviously this is season 1 done. We're going to take a break for a couple of weeks, in the sense of, you'll still be getting content. Don't worry, we're still going to be putting stuff out there, but we're going to sort of jump back into the archives first. And so Julian and I, sort of, as Julian said, has been on 20th Century Geek, the sister podcast, on a number of occasions, and we sort of did some really good reviews that sort of fit into the sort of scope of stories out of time and space. So I'm just remembering what they were now. We've got our discussion on Flash Gordon, 1980, Planet of the Apes from 1968, and then the Terry Gilliam Imagination trilogy, which is Time Bandits, Brazil, and the Adventures of Baron Munchausen. So we're going to be giving those out as sort of archival bonus material for the next couple of weeks, leading up to, well, another in-depth thing. I don't know if you want to explain our big project before we get back to season 2. What are we doing, Julian?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that these rerun episodes, it gives us more content, but I also found that, because I'm enjoying these conversations so much with you, we have these reference points because we have had these conversations and done these podcasts, and I want to let listeners get those reference points. So that, like every time we've talked about Flash Gordon over season 1, that's kind of been a touchstone. It's like, yeah, there's this conversation, but listeners who just have followed this podcast haven't heard it. So but beyond that, after that series of sort of reruns, we're going to move into Red Dwarf, and
Mm.
both of us are in love with this show, a little
Yes.
obsessed with this show, uh, and so we're going to be doing multiple episodes and watching all 12 series of Red Dwarf.
Mm.
So quite a big order, a tall order, and a tall order for discussion. But I know that it's going to blow my mind because I know your dwarf, and
Yeah.
and it's a series that has influenced me and made a big difference in terms of how I saw science fiction, and what science fiction could do. And I am astounded that it's not more well known or hasn't taken off over here more than it has.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, it's sort of, even in this country, it's become sort of a niche thing. It should be celebrated more, I think. But yes, I can't wait to get into that. That's going to be it's going to be a mammoth task, but it's one I take on with relish. I'm really looking forward to it. So we've got some fantastic and amazing things coming up for you in the next sort of couple of months. So
And
if
then we
you
move
have,
on to season 2, which we've
well, I was just
already
saying,
announced the titles of. At
we've
the end
announced
of
it, yeah.
yeah.
And we'll get back to we'll re-announce those again as we get closer. So really, 2020 is looking strong. We've got some fantastic content coming. We've got some really good stuff. I'm really excited for it. I can't wait. I'm really, really looking forward to some of the conversations we've got coming up. But
Well,
I should say,
go ahead.
if listeners have been enjoying this content and enjoying our conversations, let us know. And I don't just mean, find us on Twitter. Obviously, it's at Pod Timespace. But what I really want people to do is go out, go onto your podcast catching platform, whatever it is, and leave a review. Leave a review. Doesn't have to be a 5-star review. Just any review. Just leave us a review. What do you think of what we're doing? Are you enjoying it? It just helps us get out there, get us up the rankings, lets more people see what we're doing.
Amen.
And that's really important. So yeah, please just go and give us a review. We'd really appreciate it.
And I hope that listeners know that it should be apparent that this is a real labor of love. That we love these movies, we love science fiction, and we love talking about it with each other. And Stories Out of Time and Space is not going to make us millionaires. And what would mean the most to us, I think, would be having that audience that appreciates it. And so anything that you as listeners can do to, give those reviews and get the word out there and increase the audience is, that's what we want for this. And that would mean the world to us.
Indeed, yeah, and we do appreciate everybody that listens and engages with us. Really appreciate it. So,
I don't.
We've been chatting for quite some time.
I'm just joking.
Screw them. Screw them all.
Have you seen those idiots? Oh my god.
Yeah.
Oh.
Now I'm going to edit all this out. But yeah, Julian, thanks very much. We've been chatting for some time on this one. At one point, we thought this would be a season review. It's going to be a nice short one.
Yeah.
But it's been a great conversation as usual. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, we will catch you again soon.
There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.